and indeed questions. So I will share my screen. There we go. So the next sequence of slides are about my summation of what I think is best practice from the different sources that I identified earlier. And each of the different domains are illustrated by some safeguarding adult reviews that are in the public domain. So 9 components, as you can see from 9 components of the evidence base for direct practice with individuals. None of this will come as a surprise to you. We've touched on some of this already. So the ones that I'll emphasize are the ones that perhaps we haven't yet really focused on. Really important that mental capacity assessments are thorough and include a focus on executive functioning or executive capacity. In other words, the capacity to act, particularly important where you have got repetitive patterns, rather like was being described just before the break, when somebody continues to trash rooms and so forth. Is there frontal lobe damage to the brain, which doesn't affect how people talk about decisions, but does affect what they do. So the importance of thorough assessments, particularly of mental capacity. The importance of thinking family, just to family and social networks, just to pick up the point that I made about how little we sometimes know about individuals, and that family members and people in an individual's social network might have information that would help us to understand what is going on. And their legal literacy is important, because it is not a breach of a person's right to private and family life if we approach people and ask what they know about an individual that might help us in our work. And then lastly, the importance of transition as opportunities to provide wraparound response. So whether that is transition from hospital into the community, transition from prison into the community, transition from being a young person in care to being a young adult care experienced and leaving care. I'm trying to avoid the use of the word discharge because I don't like that word. I much prefer to focus on transition, what somebody is transitioning into, and how we can support that process more effectively. So 9 components of the evidence base, and illustrated with some safeguarding adult reviews. The first of which is Duncan, published by Croydon, a person with adverse experiences going back to childhood, significant mental health and substance misuse issues, experiencing periods of homelessness. He was very clear what he thought would be most likely to help him after his last discharge from mental health detention, but in fact his expressed wishes did not feature in the aftercare plan that was put in place for Duncan rather than with Duncan. So they're learning here about making safeguarding personal. And the Mental Health Trust closed down their involvement, discharged him from a 117 aftercare plan, even though his mental health needs had not abated. and there was not an adequate risk assessment before the Mental Health Trust took that decision. A review done in Havering, actually of 2 care experienced young people experiencing periodic homelessness, both as young people and then as young adults, highlighting again the importance of a wraparound support, highlighting the importance of children's social care and adult social care, children's mental health and adult mental health services working closely together. And a reminder of the need to think family in this context, understanding the very complicated, complex family dynamics and relationships that both of these young people experienced. I've mentioned the Haringey thematic review already, so I won't repeat what I said, particularly about understanding an individual's ethnic background. There was an absence of mental capacity assessments in the 3 cases that review focused on. And the voices of lived experience also really endorse the different components of the evidence base. And I think we have covered much of that in the conversation we had earlier, including being careful about the use of language, particularly when we talk about engagement. And a reminder that making safeguarding personal is a key part of adult safeguarding, including when working with people experiencing homelessness, and making safeguarding personal and making every adult matter, I think, neatly fit together. But perhaps if the board is involved in endorsing the making every adult matter and making every contact count approach to working with people experiencing homelessness, providing a briefing that reinforces how those 2 approaches support making safeguarding personal, that might be something the board could usefully do. And then the team around the person, 9 components of the evidence base for the team around the person. Again, I think we have touched on this in our earlier conversation in the virtual room. But I would want to highlight here particularly legal literacy in relation to information sharing, that it is permissible to share information without consent when that is necessary in the public interest to safeguard a child or an adult at risk. And to emphasize the use of multi-agency meetings, whether you call them multi-agency risk management meetings or complex case meetings or high-risk behaviour panel meetings. What strikes me in so many of the cases that I've reviewed is that services do not come together. And even where the Safeguarding Adult Board has published procedures that clearly expect the use of multi-agency meetings, that people are confused about which type of meeting to use when and who is responsible for convening them. So particular points I would emphasize there. And again, some human stories from Safeguarding Adult reviews, again pointing out why this part of the evidence base is so important. So in Duncan's case and in the Haringey thematic review, a total absence of multi-agency meetings. In the Havering case, there were meetings, but the plans were insufficient to reduce the risks involved and to ensure collaboration across services. So meetings have to be action-oriented and indeed held sufficiently often for the plans that have been put in place to be reviewed and, if necessary, revised. And a particular review of a gentleman who died at a bus stop in Hackney. He repeatedly returned to the bus stop. No one really inquired with him, or indeed with people in that particular part of Hackney, as to why he might have returned to that bus stop. In fact, there were connections with religious and ethnic and cultural activities in that particular part of Hackney that resonated for MS with his own particular background, that might have explained why that particular bus stop was the geography that he often returned to. There weren't multi-agency meetings, so again it reinforces that message. There was an attempt on one particular occasion to conduct a mental capacity assessment. There were representatives of 4 different services present when that was being attempted, but they did not agree on who the lead decision maker was in relation to the decision that was the focus of the capacity assessment. And because they didn't agree, they walked away and did nothing, and MS died before the capacity assessment could be returned to. And then lastly, and this picks up my concern that I expressed earlier about Section 42 decisions on Section 42 referrals, there were 2 adult safeguarding concerns that were referred in relation to MS. No one challenged the local authority decision making. Neither case resulted in an adult safeguarding inquiry, and neither case resulted in an effective triage decision that might have focused, amongst other things, on safeguarding MS. In my judgment as the reviewer in that case, and this was not challenged by the board or by the Director of Adult Social Services, the local authority's decision making in both cases was unlawful. And then adult N, no multi-agency risk management meeting despite repetitive patterns and repetitive concerns. No lead agency or key worker appointed in that particular case, and very few referrals of adult safeguarding concerns, and none of those referrals resulted in a Section 42 inquiry. So how assured are you that decision making around adult safeguarding concerns in Hertfordshire is secure? People with lived experience emphasise the importance of collaboration. They expect us to talk to each other, surprising as that might be, or not. They do expect us to share information. They want us to share information very often because they don't want to repeat their stories. They expect us to collaborate, but equally, they warn us that we should not assume that they understand what is meant by the phrase adult safeguarding. We might understand what we mean by that, but that's not necessarily clear to the individuals we're working with. 6 components of organisational support for the team. This includes commissioning and commissioners and providers talking together about where there is service stretch, where there are pinch points, and where there are gaps in provision, or where a recalibration of provision might be useful. And we touched on that, for example, when looking at co-location. The rest of this really focuses on us being able to answer the question, who looks after our staff? And if we were to talk to practitioners and operational managers across all of the services involved, statutory and third sector, what would they say when we ask the question, who looks after you? Do you have access to supervision, support, and specialist advice in order to enable you to navigate through the kinds of complexities and challenges that you encounter? And again, returning to some of the human stories that emphasize the importance of the different components of this part of the evidence base, including this particular case where there was very clearly a commissioning gap in the Isle of Wight in relation to hostel accommodation that could accommodate somebody who was still dependent on alcohol. And actually, there is a good news story here. This particular review has resulted in commissioners and providers across the services in the Isle of Wight establishing what is known as Howard's Hub. And that is a whole system response to individuals who have physical and mental health issues, who appear to be or are dependent on alcohol or other substances, and whose accommodation is not secure. So Howard's Hub is a direct result of the agencies reflecting on the learning from this particular review and taking the learning forward into service development. And the Leeds thematic review, which I highlighted much earlier in the presentation, looking across the different systems involved and thinking about prevention, intervention and recovery, and recalibrating the systems and the services in Leeds to respond to what was found through the thematic review. And again, people with lived experience have perspectives on this particular part of the evidence base. They welcome wraparound support being commissioned. They also welcome being involved in co-producing solutions, and that might be something that commissioners and providers and the board might want to engage with people with lived experience. How do they define making every adult matter, and what kind of services would they recommend being developed on the basis of their previous experiences? And they also highlight the importance of supervision and staff support, and indeed managerial oversight of complex cases. And then lastly, 6 components of the evidence base for safeguarding adult boards, to which you have already responded in Hertfordshire by commissioning a thematic review, which will begin after Easter, and by having homelessness as a strategic priority. And indeed, some safeguarding adult reviews do make recommendations in relation to people experiencing homelessness, recommendations about governance, that is. And here I would particularly want to emphasise the importance of the board reaching out beyond familiar statutory and third sector partners, reaching out to DWP that might have a contribution to make, the Department for Work and Pensions, particularly when individuals are entitled to back payments, which might then run the risk of financial abuse, and for people who are housed, whether temporarily or more permanently, organisations like the Royal Mail and utility companies, and indeed police community support officers, examples of people, if you like, who may be able to spot things that are not immediately obvious to statutory services. And people with lived experience also offer comments about governance, and they also offer comments about national social policy. And one of the sadness is, I think, as we emerge from the pandemic, is that in relation to people experiencing homelessness, we have not learned from the positive outcomes of the Everybody In initiative when the pandemic was in full flow, as it were. We got a lot of people off the streets, and the result of that was that we were able to meet people's health and social care and accommodation needs, so that not everybody that we got off the streets has returned to the streets by any means. And yet the funding that was made available for the Everybody In initiative has ceased. And there is a very real risk, I think, that we are going backwards nationally rather than forwards. I'm going to stop there because I'm conscious that I may be speaking too much, and that it's important for you to reflect, or to continue to reflect, on the contributions I'm making. Some of the final slides are just ways of adding to the evidence base, and there are some slides towards the end on legal literacy, not least the Homelessness Reduction Act 2017. But I may or may not get there. I think it's important to enable you to speak your truth, if you like, both to me and to Liz and board members. So I'll stop and come back into the virtual room and see what observations you have to make or what questions you might want to ask. And I did spot in the chat last time I looked a question from one of you: is there a London borough that's got it right? City of London might be one place that I would look to, along with by borough, Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster. But I'd probably start with the City of London. There are social workers specifically commissioned in the city to work with people experiencing homelessness. So I would probably look at the city as a starting point if you're looking for a London borough. Anyway, colleagues, is someone going to break the silence and share observations, reflections, or questions relating to what I have covered since coffee?
There must be somebody that wants to ask a question. Go on, Helen, and then Christopher.
Someone has put their hand up. Christopher's very official, putting his hand up. I'll just barge on in there. I can't help myself. Michael, really interested when you started to talk about Mental Capacity Act, the use of Mental Capacity Act assessments, human rights assessments. Again, just to reiterate, I'm a commissioner, not a social worker or practitioner, but obviously commissioning is critical to this. But just in relation to some of the conversations we have been involved in, where we've talked about they have capacity, they are making, we talk about unwise decisions. I don't know whether I agree with that or not really, but you know, that kind of when we apply that to people we are talking about here, the terminology unwise decision is just almost, in my mind, a bit ridiculous. But it's that element of they have capacity, there's nothing we can do. And then you're talking a little bit more there about, you know, acquired brain injuries or damage to frontal lobes and just all those things. How, in your experience of the reviews and the work that you've done, how far do we go? You know, can we push that in terms of if someone's coming back saying, no, we've done a capacity act, they've got capacity. I don't feel in a position ever to challenge that particularly. So,
and it might not be your role to challenge it,
exactly,
Helen,
yes, exactly,
because of you know, the fact that your role is clearly, as you've articulated, commissioning, and you will have, you know, training, qualifications, and so forth that have resulted in you having that strategic role. but I would see, for example, if it is a social worker that has done the capacity assessment, that social worker will have a supervisor, will have a team manager, will have a senior manager. You know, there is a well-defined hierarchy. GPs will have a named GP and named nurse in what is now the ICB, what was the clinical commissioning group. And indeed, there might be in multi-handed practices, a GP within the practice that specialises in safeguarding, to which other GPs can refer, district nurses and others could access that expertise. And in mental health trusts and secondary acute care trusts, there will be people with named safeguarding roles to support clinicians. And it is their responsibility when somebody says, I have done a capacity assessment. Okay, tell me about the capacity assessment. What have you assessed? What have you looked at? If the individual is alcohol dependent or dependent on other drugs, have you administered questionnaires like the audit questionnaire that Alcohol Concern UK promote through the Blue Light project, so that you are using a variety of mechanisms in order to try to understand whether somebody does have capacity. And part of that is not relying simply on what an individual says. Because the part of the brain that controls speech is not the same part of the brain that controls our behavior. And what we know about adverse experience, what we know about trauma, what we know about alcohol dependence on other drugs, is that it can affect the frontal lobe of the brain. It can damage the frontal lobe of the brain. And that does not affect what an individual says. So an individual might be, well able to talk the talk, as it were. But actually, when it comes down to the capacity to act, they don't have the capacity to act because of the damage to the particular part of the brain. And that might become obvious through the use of standardized instruments, like the audit questionnaire. It might become obvious when you look at repetitive patterns of behavior, and you start questioning the individual about the repetitive patterns of behavior, or when you simply see the repetitive patterns of behavior. And what the Court of Protection has begun to emphasize in capacity assessments is real world observation, to quote a judge in one particular case, that we need real world observation. What do people do? What sense do we make of what people do? And when we feed that back, can they use or weigh, as well as understand and retain, what we are feeding back? So sorry, I could go on about executive functioning for ages. But I suppose my message to you, Helen, is that if somebody says to you, this person has capacity, your pushback might be, how do you know?
Oh, I will.
Yeah.
Colleagues, are you listening for those?
And
Yeah.
if you don't have the expertise to pursue that conversation, because that's not within your role and responsibility, and it's not in your professional training and so forth, then you need to ensure that somebody else is pushing that conversation forward.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen. We just make assumptions too often. And yes. Equally, even if you determine at the end of the day that somebody does have capacity to take a particular decision, it doesn't follow from that there is nothing we can do.
No, absolutely.
So, for example, somebody might be the victim of coercive and controlling behaviour. They might be the victim of undue influence. You can go to the High Court and ask the High Court to intervene in situations of undue influence, coercive and controlling behaviour. And even if that is not present, we shouldn't just be walking away, abandoning people, if you like, to their, in quotes, unwise decision.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I have sat on cases where health professionals have actually stated we've just got to get them to stop drinking. And even me and again, I'm just like, well, don't know where to go with that. So, you know, there is so much. And Liz, I'm tapping away furiously on Teams to you about my thoughts that what we can do after this in terms of some of the, you know, practice. But anyway, I'll let other people come in and have their say. Thank you very much.
And I know, I mean, I'm not alcohol dependent, but I do enjoy a glass of wine and I do enjoy a glass of beer. And, you know, I begin to think about, well, should I actually do that 7 days a week? You know, wouldn't it be much better if I was just a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, a glass of wine, glass of beer? By God, is that difficult sometimes to resist the temptation to open the cupboard and get out a bottle of real ale or something? You know, and I'm not alcohol dependent, but you know, we all, don't we, experience impulses to do things which actually, if we sat back, we would think, that's probably not terribly sensible. Maybe we shouldn't do that. You know, if we can recognize that we all have impulses to do things, then we might recognize the absurdity of saying to an individual who is alcohol dependent, you need to stop drinking.
Yeah.
Yes, of course they need to stop drinking, but we need to understand why they're drinking in the first place.
I need to step away from the jammy dodgers. That's mine. I'm gonna stop now.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing the jammy dodger. I've got a cream cake downstairs that I might eat later. We'll see. Christopher, you've got your hand up.
Goodness me, that took some time, didn't it?
Yeah, sorry about that, Christopher.
That's all right. I'm quite saddened by this on reflection. You've asked for my reflective thoughts, and I think it was in 2000. I led a team in Westminster and Camden, which to work with street homeless people, which was designed by Louise Casey, believe it or not. And we took it to Camden, and it was a multi-agency approach. We used harm reduction or harm minimization, whatever term you want to use. And, you know, we had pretty much everyone around the table, including the police. So it was an operational kind of perspective. But without the police involvement, it wasn't going anywhere. So we had to bring them in to ensure that the people that they were meeting on the streets were the same people we were meeting on the streets. Yeah. And it really worked. Wow. I mean, there was a lot of voluntary and third sector people who were apprehensive about sitting around the table and speaking to police officers about people because they didn't want to be seen as being grasses on the people that they worked with. But actually, it was fundamental to the success. So it's 2023 and we're still having the same conversation. And I'm quite saddened by that because I thought, I mean, I left there in 2005 thinking, yeah, I left it in quite a bright condition, especially in Camden. And to see now in 2023 that we're still having these conversations is really sad. And that was pre-Mental Capacity Act, and it was a very much a person-centered social care and enforcement approach. Social care, I used to train the police officers and actually get them to realise and recognise the person they might be talking to would have suffered trauma, would have come from children's homes, would have come from prison, would have come out of the army or the you know the services, and that you're working with a person, not someone who is creating an issue. Don't get me wrong, we had several challenges around ASBOs. I mean, Camden wanted to ASBO everybody, and it was like operationally that wasn't going to happen because that wasn't the way that we thought that was the best way to function. I mean, there were some that were required. I mean, London's different now than it was in 2005, don't get me wrong, and I understand all the gang stuff and, you know, the recourse to public funds is much more apparent than it was back then. But it was really worth digging in and actually getting the police to engage and actually getting them to recognise that actually this isn't just about enforcement, it's about social care, person-centred approaches. And I think if this is going to work, taking it forward, you have to bring them on. You have to train the officers. I mean, we know what's going on in London now from the comments that were made by Louise Casey, funnily enough, yesterday, and her report. But it's fundamental to get the police to think about the person rather than someone as a criminal. And I think when they did come on board, we worked really well. It was hard work, I mean, I was chairing meetings where these agencies were not happy to have the police officers sit next to them even, but we brought them round, and we ended up doing street walks with the police. We ended up, you know, ended up on Newsnight, actually. It was quite interesting. But we kind of got them on board, and I think that's a key area that the third sector, the voluntary sector, and ourselves as well, need to really be clear about what their role and responsibility is. So, and we were using prescribing services. We had GPs on board. We had the local hospital, which was UCL. Sorry, there's noise in the background. Shush, please. I'm just on a call. And it was fundamental to success in Camden. It's changed now again, and obviously the climate's changed and post-COVID and everything. But I think it's really important that we acknowledge that they do have a role in this situation.
Absolutely.
That's what I wanted to say.
No, I'm fully agree with you and your direction of travel, and indeed Flash has put in the chat that when Flash was last in Camden, things were working well. Sorry, it's Scott, isn't it? Not Flash, but well, maybe you answered to both. Flash Gordon comes to mind, but maybe you don't wield your sword in quite that way.
No, I haven't bullied Tom Brown for a long time. But no, this Mick O'Grady is the officer in Camden that does the street homelessness.
Yeah.
And he works brilliantly with the navigators and is very much on the street, and is the first point of call for the hostels, plus also the police.
Yeah.
He's very much in the know and links up with all the safeguarding referrals, MARAC, etc. So
right.
You have a real contact.
Yeah, but I think the point that you've made, Christopher, enables me to say something. I qualified as a social worker in 1978. In 1978, we were talking about social workers don't get adequate supervision. We were talking about care experienced young people and the poverty of provision for care experienced young people becoming young adults. And sometimes I think here I am in 2023 at the ripe old age of 71, thinking about how much longer might I continue to plough a social work, an adult safeguarding furrow, and we're still talking about social workers don't get quality supervision. We're still talking about the poverty of provision for care experienced young people. Yes, we're talking about things that we weren't talking about in 1978, like self-neglect, like homelessness. But how much longer before we recognise that there is so much more that we know we could do if we were given the resources. I think financial austerity and the impact of that on the police, on the NHS, on local authorities, on the third sector is part of this. But we know if we invest in prevention, and everybody in a sense was an investment in prevention, we actually save money in the longer term. Anyway, I keep going, but yeah, at times I feel outraged that we are still, and then somebody will come back and quit. Well, Michael, you're outrageous. Well, okay, so I'm outrageous. I'm outraged, as well as being sad that we are still having to do this. But if we flip that, Christopher, what I think we have is an evidence base. So what you can do in Hertfordshire is to say, how close do we get? And where there are remaining obstacles or barriers, what can we do within our county to address those obstacles or barriers, recognising that the legal rules might frustrate us, no recourse to public funds, and we might never have enough resources to do what we really want to do. But is it possible to move forward? And some places have done that. I mentioned East Sussex before. Okay, I'll come back to you, Christopher, if we have time, but I ought to go to Sue and then Angie. Sue?
Hi, well, just very quickly in defence of the police, because I was one for 30 years. I'm now the safeguarding lead for Dacorum Borough Council and have been for the last 4 years. And I certainly remember a time when I worked in child protection from 1998 for 16 years. And yes, we've all seen a backward slide without a shadow of a doubt. And I think it's directly related to funding and the rising level of need. So it's a real combination. But I think one of the points that you've made that I'm reflecting on is around how we escalate and challenge our colleagues. And I think we do have a really good, clear escalation policy. Our Hertfordshire Safeguarding Adults Board have got that. But what I see from my colleagues in housing, and you talked earlier about that revolving door of mental health adult care services, see it frequently, all the time. I could give you example after example. Unfortunately, I was trying to think of homeless examples, and we haven't got as many of those to give you the example for, and I'm trying to keep it within topic. But that escalation policy is very difficult to apply when you don't know who to contact in your partner agencies. So it tells you what to do, but because the people who you would want to speak to in your partner agencies, so in mental health services or even in adult care services, or any of the other agencies that we work with, are not accessible to us. So really what I'm finding is when I go back to my colleagues who are experiencing these difficulties and they can't get anywhere, it's because they're not following an escalation process, because actually the contacts are not easy for that. And so reflecting on what you said, I think there's an area there that we might be able to improve, or might also be in the process of being improved, so that we can then use what we've already got in place to work together. And I think that'd be a really positive way of sort of improving how we do challenge and work together to solve problems for people.
Lovely, thank you, Sue. And yes, it's about being a learning community, isn't it? And seeing escalation not as a criticism, but as an opportunity. Yeah, I'm glad you got an escalation policy, but if it is not achieving the ambition of the policy, then there's a clear message there for the board. Thank you for that, Sue. Angie? Hello, Angie. You'll need to unmute yourself. Maybe you're having problems unmuting yourself. In which case, while I'm waiting, Christopher, you put your hand back up.
Yeah, I was just thinking about capacity and working with learning disability now. It can take 10 to 15 attempts to recognise the different languages you need to support someone. Yeah. And I think it's really important that working with street homeless people, when I did, is we would go and meet someone. It could take 10 to 15 times before they start to engage. And I think it's really important that in terms of capacity and looking at the language that's used and making reasonable adjustments to ensure that you're getting the right information and you're giving the right information is the most important factor. And this is our bread and butter work, really, to be honest. And we got good supervision, by the way. Just wanted to point that out.
Maybe I should come and work in Hertfordshire again then.
More than welcome.
Okay, a senior manager once described me as uncontrollable, so you might want to think twice about the offer. But anyway, there you go. It was a long time ago, I hasten to add. Angie, have you worked out how to unmute yourself? It would appear not. So maybe, Angie, you could put your contribution in the chat, since we can't hear you, but you've got your hand up. Anyone else want to share any observations? If not, I'll just check that there isn't anything in the chat that I need to respond to. Yes, Christopher, I would encourage you the board to review the Everybody in Initiative outcomes and what's been achieved and what one can learn from that. We certainly did that in Brent just before I stopped being the independent chair in Brent. We actually looked at what the outcomes were of everybody who had been brought in, and actually there was some positive, good news stories within that. So I would certainly encourage that if you haven't already done it. Louise is pointing out that we've got a new nickname for Scott. So there you go, Scott. You've got something to live up to, or live down, as the case may be. I don't think that there's anything else that some people have been putting resources into into the chat, which is useful. Okay, right. It's 16 minutes past 12. I could go back to the slides and just whiz through them if you would like me to do that. In the absent, yes, I see some nods. So a quick run through of some final slides. So here we go. I'll put them on full screen. So with AD Cooper, with whom I've done some work on homelessness and adult safeguarding, AD chairs the boards in Haringey and in City of London and Hackney. We've looked at the 6 principles for adult safeguarding that are in the statutory guidance, and this slide is our attempt to match what we know about adult safeguarding and homelessness against the 6 principles. So I offer that for what it's worth. Both AD and I think it's also important to dispel some myths around adults, around making safeguarding personal. And certainly one of the myths I think we need to dispel is the myth that all we need to do is to identify a person's wishes, feelings and desired outcomes. We need to do much more than that, and that includes offering our perspectives for an individual to think about what we think might be helpful that they might not have considered. And then I promised you some slides on legal literacy, and I think each board needs assurance that the different services involved with adult safeguarding and homelessness understand their roles and their responsibilities within the legal rules, and understand the roles and responsibilities of other services involved. And I start with the Homelessness Reduction Act because in my experience as a SAR author, there is a variability in people's understandings about the duty to refer, and variability in terms of how housing authorities respond when they receive a referral of a person already homeless or likely to be homeless within 56 days. So a slide on the Homelessness Reduction Act, a second slide on the Homelessness Reduction Act, and then a slide which reminds us about the duty to cooperate that is within the Care Act, and indeed within the Care Act and the statutory guidance, the roles and responsibilities of how adult social care and housing services are meant to work together. A reminder that the Domestic Abuse Act seeks to ensure that victims of domestic abuse are seen as in priority need in relation to homelessness. And that's it. And some references that you might find helpful if you don't already know them. The reference I would, or the 2 references I would particularly highlight, not simply because I authored them, but the two references published by the Local Government Association and the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services, where I drew on a variety of contributions, including from people with lived experience, to try to capture the evidence base in detail, which I have gone through today. And then if you want to follow this up with A.D. Cooper, we put together an edited collection of chapters. Chapter 3 is actually authored by people with lived experience of homelessness, talking about what helps and what did not help them to navigate through homelessness. One of the contributions to that chapter is now a senior manager within a local authority, working in public health and the homelessness sector of the local authority, and another of the individuals who contributed to that chapter on lived experience is now working for a substance misuse service. There's also a chapter on people with no recourse to public funds and the relevant legal rules that might enable you, particularly in adult social care, to support somebody with otherwise no recourse to public funds. So you might find that book helpful, and there is a discount if you quote the discount number that is actually on the slide. Okay, I think that's it from me. So I'll stop sharing, come back into the whole room, take any final observations or questions in the 8 minutes that are left before I hand you back to Liz. So any final questions or any final observations before I hand you back to Liz?
Angie's managed to put her comment in the chat.
All right, maybe I should look at the comment in the chat. Let's see what Angie said. Okay. Angie's saying she feels the structure needs an overall review. There is a lack of resources, particularly around individuals in mental health. Okay, thank you, Angie. I think that's something that Liz and the board can take forward as part of its strategic priority. One of the things, going back actually to Christopher's observations and Scott's observations about Camden, one of the things that we did, that I participated in Camden, was that we actually took a case. We looked at a specific case of how services responded to an individual experiencing homelessness in Camden, and we explored the learning from that particular case. And then we asked a group of practitioners and operational managers from across the different services to talk about what enabled good practice and what got in the way of good practice in Camden. And then their observations, their contributions were listened to by senior leaders in Camden, who then responded with, "You've said, we will." And actually, when we get to the thematic review, Liz, and the learning event part of the thematic review, what I will propose to the board is that we run a half-day learning event in 2 parts. And the first part is what can we learn from the cases that, or the situations that are within the review. But then the second part will be to invite operational managers and practitioners to talk about what enables us to get close to best practice in Hertfordshire and what gets in the way, with senior leaders, including yourself, Liz, and Helen as a commissioner and others of you in senior leader roles, then to respond with, "We've heard, we will." I think that's it from me. It's 24 minutes past. Unless there are any other contributions from people in the virtual room, I think I'll hand back to you, Liz, and hope that the session's been useful to you all.
Thanks, Michael. I think it's been absolutely excellent as always, and it just brings out how much actually how much that we are doing in Hertfordshire, because we are doing a lot of work, and we have done a lot of work, and we have progressed significantly. And I know someone put in the chat about the homelessness in Watford district, that they've reduced from, I think, from 85 to 5. So there's some really good work that is taking place. And we have got lots of projects that we are looking at, the meme, the homelessness. We've just commissioned a Making Safeguarding Personal project that we are actually employing somebody to do some deep dives into making safeguarding personal. So we are doing a lot of work, but we still have got lots of work to do. And I think for you today, Michael, you are not our first step, because like I say, we have brought lots of work already taking place, but this is to bring your thoughts to a broader audience. So for me, that is absolutely brilliant. And then the next step is the thematic review and the practitioners event. So I think that's really important, and the backing of the board as well, to look at actually what comes out of it is then how and what can we bring into place to Hertfordshire to make sure that we support as many people as we can. And Helen, let's be outrageous together. Lovely. Can always rely on Helen. Can I just thank you very much for your time, Michael. It has been absolutely fascinating having you speak to us. So thank you. Anybody, if you have got any comments, please make sure you put them in the chat, because we will be able to keep those. The recording and the slides will be available. So where you booked on to the event today, if you go back onto there, you will be able to get access to those slides, but please give Jean a chance to do that. So don't go straight back on. They'll probably be available either later on today or tomorrow if you want those slides. Michael's put his details up. So again, in depth, if there's anything that you feel that you need, we can facilitate that, I'm sure, when Michael's here doing that review for us. So that leaves me to say thank you, everybody, for your attendance this morning. I hope you have got something out of it. I'm sure, as I said, I have, and I can see the comments that a lot of other people have. So thank you very much for your time this morning. And once again, thank you very much, Michael, for your time. We do appreciate it. Pleasure. Thanks, everybody. And I hope you have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well done, Liz.
Oh, thank you, Michael. That was absolutely